bit of time. Anybody has any comments about the panel discussion or Hashi or Paul's talks? I would like to open it up. Yes, Julian.
Thank you all very much. I've been really enjoying the conversation today so far. And my question is for Paul Swanson. Sorry, you're not on the dais, but for you. But it's actually for everybody, and it has to do with this thing that people have mentioned a little bit, a couple of people have mentioned, which is to think about the terminology that we use and to think about how our terminology might be exportable to other contexts. This is like my favorite thing to talk about. Japanese religious studies have something to contribute to the world. I think we really, really need to make that case. But I think we also have to consider which of our terms are most useful to other people. So Paul Swanson said before, we should think about Shinbutsu Shugo or Shinbutsu Yugo as a universal category. And I think my initial reaction is yes. And then I'm like, but Shinbutsu Shugo or Yugo, whichever one you're talking about, is always an ex post facto category. It's always a reaction to this idea that we've reified some other categories, Kami and Hotoke, or Shinto and Buddhism. So we're talking about the present, like observing things in real time. We can't use something like Shinbutsu Shugo, right? We can only talk about it in terms of like, oh, we have these reified categories and we treated them as separate, but actually they've been the same thing together all along. So I was wondering if we need to, as we're thinking about exporting our terminology, think about which one of our categories are actually helpful for other people. And I would love to hear somebody make a case for where Shinbutsu Shugo is really, really helpful for observing something that's happening in real time, not something that we're observing after the fact.
Yeah, thank you, Julian. Actually, I wasn't advocating using the term Shinbutsu Shugo in an international context. So I agree with you, but I was thinking more in the terms that the insight or perspective that Shinbutsu Yugo or Shinbutsu Shugo stands for, that it's a combination of various factors. You know, I don't know what would be the best English term for that, but that insight, if that can be used, maybe prefacing by saying, well, in Japan it's this way, and that teaches us something about you know, not necessarily Japanese phenomena, but you know, something also outside Japan. But is that what you're getting at? I think.
Thank you so much for the response. Yeah, it's of course not necessarily using the Japanese language to describe other things because that's just going to be confusing for our colleagues in other fields. But I understood you to be saying the conceptual sort of framework is something that's exportable, something that could be applicable to other places. But I still wonder if we then end up if we end up building in some of the same prejudices that already existed in our own terms, and that's going to interrupt our ability to apply them to other places, was my concern. But I appreciate what you're saying. That makes a lot of sense.
One of the things that I took from what you said, Paul, was, is there kind of an operational mechanism in Shinbutsu Yugo that we could see, for example, in what happens for self-help culture in America, okay, where you bring in, you know, a little bit of yoga, you bring in a little bit of mindfulness, you bring in these different things. Can we learn from the history of Shinbutsu Shugo how it works mechanistically, and then think about how we could then compare that to what we see going on in America amongst people who are not religious but spiritual, and bring these things in from different places?
Also, I was thinking I didn't have to mention it in my talk, but probably this sort of thing has only been discussed to death in terms of syncretism. I mean, before my generation, I think the idea of syncretism was a big deal for a while. But so my question would be, well, what does Shinbutsu Shugo or combinatory culture offer that's maybe different or provides insight that the debate over syncretism has missed?
Good afternoon. listening what Professor Chilson said about in the present humanitarian problem, what I was thinking every time during my undergraduation, during my master's degree, I always read books from many authors from many professors, and so they are writing for people who is in the area, not for people who is outside. We don't take any actions thinking on the outside. So thinking on that, maybe humanities are in problem because people don't see what we are thinking, what we are doing. Like we not our field, we don't do like a car. We don't do a research and results in a car. Results in a publication. So what in the future the JJRS could do to try to change this problem, to let people know what we are doing?
That's an excellent point. And I think the question of public-facing research and results of research and publications and interactions is a very important question. I think for a journal like the JJRS, which is very technical, it would completely change the outlook of the journal if we wanted to make it more accessible. But I do think it's very important to have journals or outlets so that scholars who who publish in a journal like the JJRS can then also share their work or engage with topics that are related to their research. How to do that is I think tricky, right? Because then it's it's a completely different style of engagement than what I think most of any of us are trained. It's almost like a vocational aspect. Perhaps someone who has vocational teaching or training would be engaging in work or involved in any type of volunteer work or things like that if your topic is related to something environmental or along those lines. So for the JJRS, I really encourage that type of scholarship, but it would be difficult to publish in the journal as it exists today. It would be a completely different concept. Yeah, so we are publishing this volume for the Nanzan Guide and the New Nanzan Guide, which is also still, it's very academic and academically rigorous, but also much more acceptable or accessible. I don't know what acceptable. So I think auxiliary publications like that are quite helpful. Some of the things that can be used in the classroom, but then taking it to another step, which I think is the question that you were addressing, is how do we engage with people who are maybe not academics or students? How do they get them interested in the topic of Japanese religion and studying it? And I think it takes a special skill set. Anybody here have any suggestions on how to do that? Caitlin's doing it. Caitlin's a perfect example of online engagement, and you should visit her YouTube channel.
Can I have my?
You can have a microphone.
Hi, so Caitlin here, new associate editor of JJRS and other publications, and so scholarship is something that's really close to my heart. I feel very strongly about it. I'm not the only one. Jolien is also extremely active in public scholarship. So I totally agree that public scholarship requires a lot of training that is outside of the bounds of technical writing and religious studies. In terms of the JJRS, both Jolien and I have been part of this program called Sacred Rights that actually trains scholars in how to present our research in a way that is makes an argument for its significance to the public, what we can contribute today, like what can you say about medieval Buddhism that is both interesting and also relevant or impactful for the everyday person, right? So this is something that takes time and training. There are people who are specializing in this kind of work that you can collaborate with. So a lot of times people are saying to me, well, I don't have the time or like the capacity to learn how to make YouTube videos or give a podcast interview or something. Like we don't all have to become public scholars with our own channels and podcasts and things like that. But we can, I think as a journal and as an institute, perhaps point people towards resources whom they can collaborate with. So for example, my YouTube channel, Eat, Pray, Anime, this is not like a commercial for my channel, right? But one of Eat, Pray, Anime, okay, so now it is a commercial. So this is a channel that tries to teach people about Japanese religious history and culture through popular media, right? Obviously, I do global Shinto studies. I'm super interested in contemporary Shinto and computers and video games and AI and stuff like that, right? But one of the points of the channel is to collaborate with other scholars who have written articles that maybe you're not a fan of video games, like you haven't played Cyberpunk 2077 or something. That's okay, right? Work with somebody who's interested in that thing and help you translate your work on something into something else that people are interested in. So what's my point here? I think that the JJRS could, under our collaborative leadership, put people in who are publishing in touch with venues that could help them to turn that content into some other sort of content that could be consumable and thus make a difference to the public. For example, The Conversation is a website that helps scholars based at, unfortunately, primarily American universities turn their research into something that's related to the news, things like that. So we could conceivably say, okay, you've just contributed this article on medieval Buddhism to the journal. Maybe you could also go over here and do this thing with that content. And then there's a connection, you can form a partnership, and in that way we can create a network and kind of like a pipeline for scholars to dip their toe into like scholarship without making it your vocation.
Hi, thank you very much for today and on sharing all your memories and your ideas. So I learned a lot about the history of the journal. I'd like to follow up on this, not so much about public outreach, but I think actually you made an important point, which has to do with the precarity of the labor market today for many early career researchers, not least those working in Japanese religion, but more generally in the humanities, right? Now we see people doing a PhD in Japanese, working on Japanese religion, doing a postdoc or two, and then leaving academia because there are just no positions. And I highly appreciate what you were saying that JJRS has been very influential in shaping a subfield. At the same time, that subfield is under very much pressure. So the strength of the journal, that it's technical, that it's specialized, but it also makes it fragmented. So my question is, how can we maintain, well, what your thoughts about this, right? Maintain that sort of high standard and rigorous peer review process and so on, but also at the same time, open up, maybe get back some of that 1970s sociological global comparative outreach there and make the journal more interesting, not only for people working like on, say, medieval Buddhist doctrine, but also people applying like social scientific methods, anthropologists, political scientists working on aspects of religion in Japan, that they're, rather than submitting their manuscripts to disciplinary journals within anthropology or within political science, would actually consider JJRS as a good venue to get more social scientific work on contemporary Japanese religion. And also in a way that will be helpful for them in building their careers, because there's just not going to be that many jobs in specifically Japanese religion anymore, whether we like it or not. So that's the reality of the labor market that I think that young early career researchers have to face. And as a journal, we have to sort of find ways to be more proactive for that. Your thoughts.
Just from the journal's perspective, yeah, I think you're right that the editor of the journal needs to be more proactive and soliciting materials from.
It wasn't.
No, but I think the journal profile. But yeah, there's a profile, and yeah, we don't. I mentioned that our historians and literature scholars and historians, we receive submissions, from these fields, but the social sciences, we don't receive much, and I think it's because in the social sciences, there's this kind of, disciplinary journals that they submit to it. It's a bit of a pipeline. So I mean, I think, more engagement with people who work in those fields, and I have to admit that I'm ignorant of those fields and don't have very few contacts. But we could be more active in bringing people from a social sciences perspective. But the more comments, the more theoretical.
Sure, yeah, I could address this a little bit. So the journal's constrained, of course, Matt knows this, obviously, that by what comes in, what is submitted. And it is possible, of course, for the editor to get out network and try to solicit more submissions, but that can be difficult. So, and on the one hand, and then this public versus more specialized scholarship. Now, this is a tricky one too. So if we're dealing with early career scholars, particularly in the US, are facing the pressures of comprehensive review and then tenure. It's very important to publish specialized work that really advances the field of knowledge. And the issue that we have then is that there's so much knowledge out there already that to advance this line of knowledge, it presupposes a great deal of knowledge on top of that. So there are various factors that work against kind of public scholarship. Of course, there are venues for that. And what's interesting to me is that there are many more venues for public scholarship, I think, in Japan than, say, in the United States. That I know that in Japan, the year I was at Nichi Bunken, I think I gave 7 or 8 public lectures. And these were, sometimes in Japanese, talking to large crowds. And this was sponsored by Nichi Bunken in Kyoto. So, of course, they would put up posters in Kyoto and lectures open to the public, where I would talk about otogizoshi, this kind of thing. And there's a lot of interest. But in the US, it's very difficult anyway to engage in a public way because there's not a lot of public interest. I don't know why. I mean, we have, the Association for Asian Studies has, of course, the Journal Asian Studies, but they have a separate publication, Education About Asia, which is then really geared toward secondary education, high school teachers, this kind of thing. And that's a great venue for public scholarship. But we don't have that so much. I mean, what I really want to talk about really quickly, getting back to this issue that Paul brought up in his comments about accessibility of the journal, making the journal open access. And it's really, I think it's been it was great. I love this. I'm all in favor of open access. This has been a great thing. And I think it makes the journal ultimately, today, I think more important. Articles published in the JJRS today are going to be more widely read and for longer than monographs. Because I found that students, scholars, they download a PDF and they have this and it's disseminated widely and for free. Whereas for a scholarly monograph, either you have to get it from the library or you have to buy it. In some cases, you can get an ebook. Your university library might have an ebook copy, but they're only allowed to loan out the ebook to one or two people at a time. There are lots of restrictions. Okay, so I think it's more difficult to access monographs. Where I see a real change happen, this was several years ago, and Paul talked about this in his comments, when the JJRS shifted to a purely online format, abandoning the subscription model of the print journal. And I understand absolutely why the journal did this, but it changed things. Things are different now. And I think this particularly affects the guest edited volumes, thematic issues that I know in the past when I had a subscription and I would go twice a year, I would receive my copy of the JJRS in the mail and I would get the physical copy. I would open it and it's there, the printed words in front of me. And I would look at, I wouldn't necessarily read every article, but I would look at them. I would flip through it. It was inescapable. But somehow when we switch to entirely online, the PDFs are there. But if there's an article I'm looking for that interests me, I'll download that PDF. And I find that other than reading the title of the other material, I won't download it. And certainly won't download the guest edited introduction. I've written one of those. So anyway. So I think that has changed things in a way, in the way that, in the music industry, artists used to release albums. This was a big deal. You would have albums and you might have a single, but in the age of Spotify and on online streaming music services, the album is much less important now than the individual content, songs, which can be mixed, shuffled, downloaded individually. So in changing the format, it changes the way that it's read.
I just want to pose a question. What makes knowledge valuable? And, there's public knowledge is valuable. It's particularly valuable for me and university administrators. They love it because it brings attention to the university. Universities, I can speak about American universities, they trade in the capital of prestige in addition to like monetary capital. And so they want public scholarship. But making it public, making a bigger audience for it, does that ipso facto make it more valuable? What makes scholarship valuable? What makes certain types of scholarship valuable? I think we need to think about that when we think about the future of the JJRS. And I would say that what makes scholarship valuable is when it gets a group of people to think about something in a new and deeper way than they thought about it before. How big does that community have to be before it's considered valuable? For university administrators, it's got to be huge. But I think for academics who are coming up for tenure and other things, it's got to be smaller. Otherwise, it's not really pushing the field in a way, or at least not easily doing so. So I think it's worth us thinking about what makes knowledge valuable when we're thinking about the future of the journal.
I'm Julian Nascimento from Hoshino University and going to be a PhD student at University of Pennsylvania. Something that I find interesting about Professor Chilson's talk when he referred about the future and particularly the AI use in academia, because I was particularly surprised when last semester I was going to the library at the University of Pennsylvania to write my final papers, and I realized that almost everybody there that was using a computer had at least one tab open in ChatGPT doing something. And for me, being a millennial who saw and used all the transition from listening to songs in a vinyl LP and then going to the streams in Spotify, I saw that and I started thinking, oh my God, okay, there's something here that I'm missing because I have no idea what ChatGPT is yet. And so I think that it should prepare. And my question is what should it do to incorporate it to the way you write, the way you study, the way you research? And as professors, and I hope hopefully in the future, maybe I can become a professor as well. How can we understand this use in the academia, and what can you do? Actually, I'm still really confused about. I don't want to be. I don't want to feel that I'm getting like behind because everybody's using it. But is there any plans about how can we think about the production of knowledge in the future?
Future question.
I played around with ChatGPT a lot, and we are.
Matt, check his submissions.
Yeah. So I'll try to be brief because we are. For those of you old enough to remember Netscape, we are like in the Netscape era of AI. We're not even at the World Wide Web yet. Okay, and despite that, it will do amazing things for us right now. But here's my concern. Okay, my concern is this: if you type in a question, like a values-based question, the way I did it because my interest in psychotherapy, I typed in psychotherapy with a question. Like, my friend is thinking about committing suicide, what should he do, right? You ask that question in English and you ask that question in Japanese, you get the exact same answer. There is still I want to go back to what Hoshino said earlier and the point that I was trying to make with I could teach English. There is kind of an epistemological colonialism in AI. And that is what I don't hear being discussed, which kind of just blew me away when I was asking these psychotherapeutic questions, and I'm getting the exact same answers just in two different languages because the English language model is the basis. So that is that's one. The second thing, and I'll stop, is I don't know about you, but when I use a calculator and I put in the course, whatever I'm doing on the calculator, when I get an answer on the calculator, I do not doubt it. 100%. That's the correct answer. And what I fear is that in about 10 years or so, people are going to use AI as that in a way that that's the correct answer. And there will be an idea that there's absolute knowledge and truth that cannot be questioned. And I think one of the things that technical historical scholarship does is it gives a relativization of knowledge. Like if we lose the idea that knowledge is relative to a time, a place, an economic system, certain social structural powers, we are going to be in real trouble. And this is what the humanities offer. This is the value, one of the values of the humanities.
Thank you so much for this panel. I have a question. I think it's mainly for Hoshino Sensei about the making Japanese scholarship more available. And I was very struck with what you said, Matt, about that you haven't gotten any hardly Japanese articles from Japan-based or Japanese scholars in recent years. And yeah, I don't know, that kind of worries me when I think about the future. But I'd just like to hear a little bit more about what you think can be done in that area, or is it something that is just part of, is that just one of the limits of the journal? We can't do everything. Yeah, I just wanted to hear a little bit more on Hoshino Sensei or others about this.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. Well, I don't have any. I don't have any clear answers so far, but and then well, for one thing, so graduate school training. So in Japanese, many Japanese university and many professors teaching about Japanese origin or religion studies in Japanese university, they don't really, they may urge students to write in English, but they don't teach how to write. So perhaps the more technical issues should be maybe one focus. So Japanese professors, especially in research and research graduate school, may be able to push students to publish in English and publish and how to provide proper English presentation or articles. And I know some teachers, some professors are working on it, but they are still struggling yet. And then of course there is AI issues. So, oh, by the way, do you have any policy on generative AI? And it's for that. So some people say, some professors say it makes easier for Japanese students to write in English, but I still somehow doubt about that. But so sorry that I don't have any clear answer, but we need to push and then urge the Japanese young students to publish. But how to do that? How to do that? It's your program, I think.
Yeah, just kind of following up on Seiji's point there, right? Roy Andrew Miller wrote a book called Japan's Modern Myth, the Language and Beyond. Yeah, so in that book, his thesis, working thesis, which is kind of a nice relationship here, was that the religion of Japan is the language of Japan. So that would be something to explore, I think, conceptually. And then what I heard was that the current system, the allography that's taught, which I guess you could also call code switching. There's a misnomer that it's English teaching. And I don't think anybody is teaching English in Japan, certainly nobody's learning it. As Seiji mentioned, you know, they can't write in English, but they can't read in English. So, and there's people at the University of British Columbia looking into the literary Sinaitic question, and that part of the answer to this, what was lost when Kanbun was thrown out with the bathwater. And the Japanese students I know, they don't know the Genbu Nichi movement. J. Marshall Unger has looked into the post occupation language changes also, which seem to be very, very significant. That Kanbun was essentially made illegal. So that's that point. The second one is that the Shinto and the Buddhism, where's the Confucianism? James McMullen recently published a nice book on the rituals and the sacrifices and all of that. Certainly it's very active. And in the wake of Sadanobu Matsudaira, very important. So that's it.
Thank you. Those are very interesting points. That's still on.
The lights, red lights on both.
There. Okay, now it was off. Okay, back on. Yeah, those are very interesting points. Okay, there are a couple of things that you brought up here. Right. So the idea that religion is the language of Japan. I mean, this is a fascinating idea. So I said before that to understand Japanese or to understand medieval Japanese literature, you have to understand Japanese Buddhism and the cultural context. But I would also say that the reverse is true, that to understand medieval Japanese Buddhism, you have to understand literature also, because it brings up a whole other side to religion that one might not see in more supposedly orthodox texts. If you'll go back to the tale of Genji, the Tamakazura chapters is the famous scene where Genji intrudes on Tamakazura. So he's adopted Tamakazura as his daughter. Of course, being Genji, he also tries to sleep with her, but anyway, that's another thing. But he catches her reading Monogatari, and he confronts her and he says, "What are you doing?" He says, "You silly woman, this is what a waste of time to spend your day reading made-up stories that are really about nothing." And she comes back, and this is the passage celebrated as supposedly Murasaki Shikibu's defense of literature, where speaking through Tamakazura, the author writes, or Tamakazura says, "No, that's not true. It's through literature that we can come to understand deeper aspects of the human condition." I'm paraphrasing here, of course, but things that you can't learn from the classical histories. There are aspects of being alive, the human condition that we can learn and we can understand through the reading of literature. And I would say the same thing is kind of true about Buddhism, that we can read commentaries, we can study sectarian history, we can study temple histories, but to get a broader picture, it's often through these sort of fictional works that treat the struggles of individuals within particular systems. And so I think that's really important to understand this question of where's Confucianism. So that's really interesting too. But it's there absolutely in the medieval Japanese context. And this is something that I've written about and been very interested in, where there are texts that explicitly say that it's through filial piety one can gain rebirth in the Pure Land. The Nembutsu, sure, that's one way, but it's not necessarily the single practice, but honoring your parents. And we see this again and again in medieval fiction. And then really established hierarchies of piety, and it works like, I'm thinking like a 15th century work like Tsukishima in the Kawakamai repertoire, where you really see this kind of thing laid out. So it's there. Getting back to the question of what Chat GPT, I really doesn't worry me for sort of scholarship, high level scholarship, or even writing in English. What's important is having something to say. It's the insight that really matters. And so for me, when I see an article that's not a strong article, invariably, I mean, of course, there could be problems with the English, but more fundamentally, it's that someone doesn't have an insight. They've assembled data, perhaps, but haven't found something interesting really to say. And so that's important. And that's why ChatGPT, dealing with research, new research doesn't scare me at all, because I don't see it coming up with new knowledge and interpretations.
Thank you for a lovely panel. I just had one reflection on this thing that now Hoshino Sensei was talking about, and the question about language. I think there is sort of an issue that there is a conversation between Japanese academics wanting to publish in English and English native speakers. And there are a whole load of them who are not English native speakers who have learned and struggled with English as the academic language. And there is this idea that English is an academic language, it's neutral territory, and it's open for everyone, but it's not. I mean, it's owned by American academics, by British, and the rest of us struggle to learn the stuff. And my thought, listening to this, is just that maybe Japanese academics should listen more to those of us that who already struggle with these issues. Swedish academia, everyone does courses on learning to write English argument. And we had a much simpler start because we come from Germanic language, it's much easier to learn English than Swedish. Everyone in Europe does. So maybe it's not the Americans, the British people you should primarily learn, but other academics already struggle with this problem. I think I might have similar opinions to me on this. That's just the thought, the reflection.
It's a really important one, but it occurs to me that, following off of Keller's remark, that what's important is, do you have something to say? That's far more important than whether it's written in Japanese style or English style. And of course, there's extra effort that has to go into editing an article by somebody whose native language is not the language of publication. But without expending huge amounts of effort or time, you and the people in JJRS surely have a lot of contacts in the Japanese academic world. And you could just tell colleagues that if you have graduate students or younger colleagues who have especially great insights that should be shared, encourage them. Because I mean, frankly, think about those of us, who struggle to write in Japanese. I mean, I've never, of my own volition, submitted a Japanese article. If I've been invited, then it's a different matter. I'll try to do it. And the same thing might be operative.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's one way special issues are kind of a great gateway for graduate students and younger academics might be a little bit. Actually, I've invited people to join Symposium.
But I mean, your colleagues know people. It's
Yeah.
a network. Everybody knows somebody different. And if there's someone who has an insight or is doing research that is really worth making known widely, they can let you know. You could talk to others.
My favorite thing to do, even though it's my favorite thing, but the thing I prefer to do, which is very time consuming, is to work with someone who has a great insight. It's like, well, we can work together on making a great article, and maybe write part of the description in Japanese, and then we can work with them to put it into English to express their idea. That's a lot of work, and we do that quite often, and it improves the end product. But yeah.
I agree. I absolutely agree that English is not a neutral field, but I also think that writing in English for an academic audience that is interested in Japanese religion or Japanese history or Japanese literature, English is not the language to be writing in. And I've always felt that, the more work I do in English, the more marginalized I am. I marginalize myself. Whereas I've talked to some Japanese colleagues who say, "Oh, I'd really like to get an article out in English." And I say, "Why?" Because if you see the print runs of particular journals, or say a monograph produced in English, what the actual print run is, and you compare that to print runs in Japanese, if you're writing in Japanese, you're going to be much more widely read. And I too struggle, anyway, a lot to write in Japanese, and I've had help with that also. But it seems to me that to have an impact, one needs to get outside of English and really write in Japanese.
Of course, that is intention with the idea of broader access and making a larger public aware of what we do.
This whole topic of writing in Japanese and English reminds me of, must be about 15 years ago, I met Oyan at the Kokugakuin, and he had just written his dissertation in Japanese. He wanted to publish it in English. And I said, you can't write the same article in English and in Japanese, right?
Yeah.
And this is so no matter how good your English is, that's different than writing it in a way that scholarly acceptable. I mean, I've tried to write the same article in Japanese and in English. It just doesn't turn out right. So that's another issue that you have to take up with the graduate students, I think. And I think your suggestion that they read it, they see how things are structured, they see how the argument goes, how you start out with a summary and end with a conclusion. A very different style than Japanese. So writing an article in English, yeah, very complicated. And writing in Japanese too is very complicated, but maybe I could have one comment about how, as an editor over the years, there are many Japanese articles that I thought were very good, and I spent a lot of time translating them into English, and halfway through I discovered that it's just not working in English. And I was always very careful about soliciting articles from Japanese scholars. Even in special issues, it was more something they've already published, and then it was translated, but also kind of modified to fit in kind of non-Japanese academic work. So it's a very complicated thing. Well, as you both said, yeah.
Was going to tell that same story, which is that conversation actually like changed the way I look at scholarship. Like you might not think that it was, I think it was a Kokugakuin in 2007. Let me not say. So like I had just published my first article in Japanese. Before I came here, it was my first experience abroad. I had never been, many like Julia, for instance, like he's from Brazil, like, came to study in Japan, and I was going to study in the States, but I never actually got that experience of studying in the States. So I came directly here I'm originally from Brazil, and I came here to Japan, and that's where I learned from Ash Sensei and from other really nice people. But then when I published that first article in Japanese, I remember Paul, you told me that, well, that's a really good article. Like you should try writing that in English as well. I said, well, but I'm just going to be translating something I did in Japanese before. Isn't it self-plagiarism in a way? And Paul said, did you try writing that yourself in English? And I said, not yet. Do, and you will find out that it will turn into a completely different article in the end. And it did. And I've been doing that for 20 years now, and it's been working thus far. But it's the idea, I can understand, like as a foreign scholar based in Japan, I can understand the appeal of writing in Japanese. Your peers here are all Japanese, they get to read it and you get to discuss your work. But there's also this demand to foreign scholars based in Japan to write in English. So I got this a lot when I was applying for jobs, for example, in the States and in Europe. Like at that point I had a monograph in Japanese by Hozo-kan. But then I kept getting the question, why don't you have a monograph in English? Why is it in Japanese? And then it came to this point like where I was applying for these positions, actually getting to interview at some positions in the States. And I heard afterwards that were like these arguments, these discussions inside the committees. Not supposed to talk about this, but whether or not they would count my Japanese monograph as a monograph, right? So that's still a bit complicated, I think. It is very different, and it's a discussion that I've been having with Hoshino Sensei. Like I was part of up until like 2 years ago of the Religious Studies in Japan board, and I've also translated one too many articles by Japanese scholars into English. It just doesn't work sometimes, right? I got this money, I did this like all throughout like grad school, like, and sometimes it just doesn't work. Especially if you're doing like, very complicated Nihonshi articles where people are essentially just explaining these, impossible to read documents in contemporary Japanese, and you translate that into English and it's just the same text twice, right? But it works in Japanese. This is how Japanese academia works in a way, but if you try to convey that into English, that's just not gonna, So it's this complication of how to convey Japanese scholarship into English. It's still I don't think we have managed to solve that issue yet. Maybe we never will, but no.
We're out of time, so I would like to close with that. So I want to thank everyone for coming today. I want to thank Paul Swanson Sensei and Hayashi Sensei for their teamwork. And I'd like to thank the panelists for joining today to give their thoughts and insights.